Hi, well, what I want to do this morning really is take you through a very short presentation, I guess, half an hour on how I believe we can take the risk out of failure out of process improvement. I'm not going to give you a silver bullet, so don't go, I hope you're not in this webinar thinking that you're going to leave here with a very clear picture of what to do, but I'm going to talk through some of the issues that mean that process improvement projects fail. And what I want to look at is look at why people change, so try and understand what the drivers are for change, how you would get started in doing a process improvement project, how once it's started you'd manage that project, and then following that some conclusions and some managing. So why do people change? Why do people want to change? Simply because software fails, I guess, and we need to be as efficient as we can in correcting these things. Now you can see on the screen now a whole list of disasters, I guess, for want of a better word, where either life has been lost or significant financial impact has hit organisations. So as an IT discipline, we need to be as efficient as possible in stopping these things happening. Now, process is a big element of how we can be seen to be as efficient as possible. So principally what we're trying to achieve is doing the right thing in the right way, unlike these two builders who might just have a problem finding their way out tonight to go into their fish and chips. I, for one, can't see how you can get a lorry through any of those bollards on the screen. We obviously want to avoid silly mistakes like that. So what do I mean by doing the right thing in the right way? So what we're talking about here is we need to save money. So a lot of our employers or customers, maybe, if you're obviously a consultancy, are looking to make more bang for their buck. They want IT to deliver more for less, effectively. They need us to better manage and reduce the risks of development. So the issues effectively make it a smooth and an enjoyable experience as opposed to what it is today sometimes. Accelerate time to market. With competitive edge being more and more important to organisations, they need to get their software into the market a lot quicker. And unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons, testing is often seen as a reason why they can't do that. So we need to look at a way of making that more efficient. We need to reduce the delays in the software development lifecycle. So what is it that causes the most delays or the most visible delays? And that tends to be when we as testers find very serious bugs at the very end of the lifecycle, just as everybody thought everything was going smoothly. We need to think about creating better career opportunities for our testers. Today, in a lot of organisations, testers are still seen as a second-class citizen. Having good control, good process might actually start to change that in a way that when you have good process, you have good controls, you have authority levels, you can start to see how you can progress through a life cycle of your career. And finally, improve the working life of employees. How many testers today tell me that they still work the 48-hour day to get testing completed in time? And we need to find a way to make that a smoother exercise. However, on top of that, there are some significant business drivers, and one particular thing that caught my eye recently was HP and Bearing Point at the back end of 2008 did a survey of a vast majority of the UK CEOs. And one of the questions they asked them was, which of the following strategies are you expecting to employ in order to reduce or contain IT costs over the next year? So for the year 2009, I guess moving into 2010. And as you can see from the graph, 65–68% of the CEOs vouched for improving their IT process efficiency. So they see a real need to make their process more efficient. So there are many reasons why people want to change process. Unfortunately, one of probably the most predominant ones these days tends to be when a disaster happens. I particularly work for an organisation who called us in, my company, in to sort out their processes after they had a problem in production that lost them £2 or £3 million worth of revenue. That gave them a hell of a drive to actually get their process right. Underlying that were a lot of the things we've just talked about, but fundamentally they didn't want to lose that much revenue in the future. So there are lots of drivers, of which I've just shown you a few, but fundamentally, if there is no driver, then there's no need to do any process change. Now, what do I mean by that? It's kind of, it's an interesting challenge in that organisations today do or do not care about certain things, or do not have strategies in certain directions. So there's, for example, no need to have, in some organisations, a process that would find the vast majority of bugs before you go into production if their strategy was to get to production quickly, irrespective of quality. Now, I wouldn't want to work for an organisation like that, but obviously you need to bear that in mind. So you cannot drive process change around improving the testing process if actually what it's doing today meets the business objectives. So business objectives play a large part in understanding whether you do need to do a change or not. So that's giving you a bit of an introduction to why people change. There's obviously a lot more depth to that, but in the time we've got today, that's about as much as I can get into. So let's have a think about how we would start this process. So we now have a driver, we are moving forward, and we know we're going to do some change. So how do we get started? So the first thing we need to do is to understand where we are. So how do we find that out? Well, we can go to the internet and look around and see if there's any guides on there that would help us understand where we are today and where we need to go. We can get hold of some books. There's lots of books out there on the marketplace today on process improvement. We could buy one of those and we could read it and use that to help us understand where we are. We could go on courses. There are a multitude of courses available today on process improvement and test process improvement that could help. We can use standards, and what I'm going to refer to later on, ISO 15504, is an example of a standard that helps you to assess where you are. And finally, excuse me, we can do something internally, so we can get together with our internal colleagues and say, how do we understand where we are? Let's just think this through. So there are a multitude of ways available to us today to actually work out how we understand where we are. But the key thing is we need to understand where we're going as well. So what is it we're looking for? Now, you might be surprised, this was actually on the internet as a Ferrari. Not a Ferrari that I guess most people would want, but if that's what you want, if that's the kind of process you need, sort of a second-hand Ferrari process, I would say, then make that decision. But I guess most people will want the real Ferrari. In fact, that's mine. It's parked outside my house at the moment. I wish. Some people want somewhere in between. So you need to decide where it is you actually want to go. Now, having thought that one through, it's probably worth, before we go any further, stopping and saying, what actually does the dictionary definition say about process improvement? So, what the dictionaries say about test process improvement are continuous improvement of the quality and efficiency of the testing process in the context of the whole development life cycle. And that's a really key statement, in the context of the whole development life cycle. So this is not just test changing on its own, it's test changing with everybody else. If test changes on its own, there'll be some benefit, but the bigger benefit is when everybody lines up and we become one effectively, so a whole development life cycle. Interestingly, I looked at the ISTQB glossary definition of process improvement. I have a feeling they've got it slightly wrong, in that their focus seems to be that we only do process improvement at system testing and acceptance testing. Well, it says especially, so maybe they do mean all testing. My view is certainly that test process improvement is something we should do across the life cycle. So that should include development testing as well as any other testing that's being done in the organisation. So having understood that, we now need to think about how we're going to physically organise ourselves. A model we use within experimenters is a model called IMPROVE. Initiate, measure, acronym, prioritise, redefine, refine and redefine, operate, validate and evolve, improve. So what I'll do now is I'm going to go through the first three of these: initiate, measure, prioritise and plan, as we believe they're probably the most important parts of this process if you're going to get by and you're going to succeed. So let's have a quick look at initiate. So when you're initiating a project, this is the stage when you get agreement to who your stakeholders are. So who is it you're going to be reporting into? Who is it you're going to be delivering for? And who ultimately is going to be paying for the work that you're doing? So you need to get that very clearly defined. That could be quite senior. It could just be the next manager in your chain of command. But you do need to understand that. At this point, you need to be very clear about what your objectives are. So you need to work out where you're heading. What is it you're expected to do? The goals. So what are the component parts of this? How would you measure that you've been successful? what is the scope? How wide does this go? Is it just within a project? Is it your whole organisation? Is it the full test process? Is it just UAT? All those kind of things. And the coverage, so how large across the organisation will you go? And finally, you need to think about what you're going to measure against. So when we talked earlier on about knowing where you are, what is it you're going to measure against? So what is the process model you're going to use and base your improvements on? So there are many models out there today, which you can see here. Some of them, like the TMM model, is a research model, but you also have models like the TPR model, which is a commercial model, the STEP model, which is a personal opinion. There could be stage models, such as TMM, generic improvement models like CTP, and there's even models out there that will just tell you a level of maturity without telling you where you've got problems, like TOM. So there's a plethora of models out there for us all to pick from. To my mind, there is only one model that exists that has a bit of everything in it. It's also independently managed. It's not a commercial model in any way, shape or form. It's an element of research in there, and that's the TMMI model, relatively new onto the market. If you want to know any information about it, please look at tmmifoundation.org. But that basically is a derivative of all of the other models into a more industry-respected model, I guess, for want of a better word, where individuals in industry have taken the models and created something that's independent, so it's not a commercial model in any way, shape or form. So you can use that 5-stage model, much like CMM, to judge your processes against. But the choice is yours, because you can also pick to create your own model. So you could decide to sit in the leisure of your own offices and design the model you want to use yourself. Okay, so having decided the model you want to use, you then need to decide how you're going to actually do your assessments. Now, there are, again, some options out there for you in the marketplace that you can grab. There's the ARC approach, which is the appraisal requirements for CMMI. Now, I know that's CMMI, but it will give you some idea of how to structure doing an assessment. So an assessment effectively against one of the models you've chosen as your base. I mentioned earlier ISO 15504, which has the title of the Software Process Improvement and Capability Determination Standard, otherwise known as SPICE. So I think somebody cheats with determination and converts it into an E. So again, there's a standard out there you can go to which will help you see and understand how to do an assessment. And the TMMI Foundation has developed something called the TAMAR, which is the TMMI Assessment Method Application Requirements, which looks specifically at the TMMI model and instructs you on how to do an assessment against the TMMI model. Now, the key thing with your assessment approach is that you need to develop something that's, or you need to use something that's repeatable. So, for example, I was approached by an individual at a conference recently who had been asked by his organisation to develop or to identify 5 major changes and justify them for the testing area in that organisation for the year 2010. And he pulled together a one-day workshop to do that and wanted to know how he should achieve this. So we had a long discussion around the fact that he needs to create a questionnaire that's repeatable, so you ask everybody the same types of questions so you can see, you can correlate information. You need to review the documentation you've got, etc., and your career hierarchies, all those kind of things. So I think he went away wondering whether actually a day's long enough, and I would say probably not. If you need to build a business case to justify change, then you're only going to be doing a very subjective review within a day. But fundamentally, the key to doing an assessment is actually having a repeatable process so that whoever you interview to understand where they are, you interview them with the same questions. So you can compare answers and see if Joe gives you the same answer as Mike, are they actually both using the same process, all those kind of things. So you need to understand during this phase, you need to determine what your model is and also your approach to assessing against that model. So, having got through the initiate stage and effectively be ready to move on, the next step is to actually assess the process you've got today to understand where you might have some changes. So using the assessment method that you've agreed on, You can then review against the selected model, and through that process you can understand whether there are any gaps that exist in your current organisation. So effectively finding potential process improvements. Another thing I think that's good around this stage is you can identify what's good about your current organisation. It's always worthwhile telling people they're doing something well and they've got the right thing in place. So it's not just all the negatives. A traditional tester approach of these are all the things that are wrong. I think there's a great opportunity here to be saying, and here are all the things that are right. So you're doing all this stuff like that. Actually, if you did these, you could be better. Now, these potential process improvements need to account for organisational requirements. So, for example, if an organisation is waterfall, it may have a different set of process requirements to an organisation that uses an agile development approach. So you do need to understand the background to the delivery approach in an organisation to determine what the right process improvements to look at are. So this is a part of the process prior to building a business case, because without the detail of what you're going to change, it's very difficult to write the business case. The next stage, having identified all your process improvements, is about getting the business case together. So the business case is part of the prioritise and plan process. So what we need to do here is to look at those identified process improvements, potential process improvements, and identify what the priority or order in which we're going to do them in. Now you'll see the fourth bullet down there, the fourth sub-bullet down there is what is needed to achieve the next maturity level. Now, within all the models there are different levels of maturity, and some people's targets will be at maturity level. So, for example, a system integrator who's currently CMMI level 5 may very well want to check their test process to see if they can map a level. In those circumstances, it's kind of irrelevant whether the changes, the process is needed or not. In that what you need to do is have some evidence of that process in place. So that helps you prioritise. So these are things I need to do to achieve the next level. More realistically, and to give the most benefit, really what we need to be doing is making the process changes that actually help an organisation progress and improve. So you might base that on a return on investment. So this is a bit of a bang for the buck. We can make this much saving on your project if we did these changes. These changes make no saving, therefore they add no value. Let's not use them. And maybe there's an organisational strategy that determines the way in which things should be done, and in which case you might prioritise against that. You might just want to do the next best thing. So let's understand what the next step on within the model, what's the next best thing the model suggests we should do next. And on top of that, being some of the financial benefits, you might have a lot of qualitative benefits that you feel are the right would drive a priority for you. And we'll look at a few of those in a minute. So having prioritised and decided what process improvements need to be made, you can then build your development and deployment plan, and from that establish and present the formal business case for the changes. So the business case needs to contain the intangible and the tangible benefits of the qualitative and quantitative changes. It needs to include a view of timescales, but more importantly, one of the things that I see that doesn't get done enough are the quick win side of the process change. A lot of organisations who do process change kind of put people in a corner for 3 or 4 months and get them to get on with their work and forget them, and not necessarily ever seen as a success. The reality is that the way you keep people interested in what you're doing is by delivering things regularly, and no different to any normal project. And any normal iterative project, the principle of a normal iterative project these days is about delivering bits quickly and in a structured way. And that's no different to a process improvement project. Now, quick win, everybody says, I often get asked, what would I define as a quick win? So, to save anybody asking the question, I will answer that now, which is anything really. That could be a physical change, or it could just be some communication. One of the things I learned very early on was that just by communicating, sometimes that's enough. And it could be seen as a quick win, because you can tell people where you are, what you're doing, you're visible, you're not locked in a cupboard somewhere doing some work that nobody knows what you're doing. So you need to define how you're going to manage the quick win scenario. Any senior manager will ask you for that, so you need to think about that. And finally, you need to define your objectives and your priorities for the projects. They all need to be built into your business case. So let's have a look at some of the benefits we were referring to earlier, intangible benefits. So one of the things you can look at here is a clear and well understood process. So actually what we're saying is that from the organisational perspective, everybody knows what testing does, so people outside of testing understand where testing fits, and within testing, everybody understands is doing the same thing. Now that brings with it a level of repeatability of process. So if Joe is off sick, Mike can just pick up his work and keep going. Whereas I do traditionally see in organisations that's very rarely the case. When somebody's off sick, the work stops, which brings you into the reduction in the key person dependency. If you can get a repeatable process, you start to lose the dependency on particular individuals who do their work in a certain way or know more than anybody else, so we can start to get that all documented. One of the other intangible benefits is that you can start to get some common measurement of progress of testing. So if you've got a clearly repeatable, well-understood process, you can measure progress in the same way across an organisation. So individual projects can be seen to be measured identically, so you can see how individual projects compare against each other. And on top of that, you can measure the process. So rather than waiting until the end and looking back and saying, did that work, and doing what we just traditionally do in a post-implementation review is produce a report and put it in a cupboard, we can see straight away that something's starting to go adrift and can go in and try and sort the process out, so sort of proactive as opposed to reactive. We can get a clear roadmap of what the next steps of the process are. And we talked earlier on about the career opportunities that exist when you start to get a proper process in place with proper controls and authority levels. So you can start to do that. And again, start to generate a happier workforce. From the financial benefit point of view, you can see here this is a real example of a case study we've got for a particular client of ours, where there were 5 items we deemed needed to be done. They were the priority. The 5th one, as you can see, if you look in the 5th column along potential benefit, has no tangible benefit to the individual, to the organisation, but without the training, the other 4 elements wouldn't work. So ultimately, what we talked about here was providing an estimate of a benefit of about £1 million. But as it was an estimate, we were very generous and said, we can probably come in with about 900,000, with a cost to deliver of between 117 and 175,000 pounds. So a very good bang for their buck. So in principle, here's a good business case, something that would stand up. Behind this, obviously, there's lots of numbers and number crunching going on, but in principle, this will stand up against any form of scrutiny, so that people can actually be very clear what the benefits are. Get the numbers right, and you sail through your business case. So having done that, your business case, you get it signed off, you build your team, and you start to work. So at this point, you're starting to do the change. Now, this is the one bit of the process that, the bits I've just referred to, the bits that I tend to see not done so often. A lot of people, when they start process improvement, they sleep straight into doing the change without this preparatory work and its organisational involvement. So do remember, this is the original, these initiate, measure, prioritise and plan are really key activities rather than going straight into the change. So let's look at how we manage the change. So in principle, we're talking about a program of activity. So we're not talking about one project, we're talking multiple projects. And these will vary around all organisations and what needs to change. But the one common denominator has to be the implementation and communications element of the project. If you do not communicate, you die. I was doing a presentation rather recently, and a gentleman in the audience was telling me about the fact that he was doing process change, and he had been for 5 years. And very recently, his boss had told him to just stop doing it. I asked him what the background was, and in principle, he'd been doing some really good changes, and the only people that really benefited those were the people below him, because he'd never actually come above the parapet and told anybody what he was doing. And the moment he did, because he'd been doing this in the background, he got his legs chopped off by his management. So it's very important that from day one we communicate. An example I give you here is an example when I worked on a project where we were doing an implementation to about 400 testers across the UK. And our first series of communications were just before the project started, and we travelled the country, and the first thing we did when we met groups of people was ask who was a tester. Nobody put their hands up. The moment they'd seen what we were doing, they understood a bit more. Every time after that, when we said, who's a tester, everybody put their hands up that was a tester, which showed that slowly we were converting these people to realising we were doing something of benefit to them, and they started wanting to work with us, started wanting to help us, as opposed to be seeing as somebody on the outside. So communication of the change is really, really key. Without that, your project dies. However, probably more important to think about is the people aspect of change. There's been some work done that's identified that probably about 20% of any process change is best in the documentation, you know, the training, the process, the templates, etc. And 80% of any change is about culture and people. And as the old saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we can write the world's best process, but if nobody uses it, it's a waste of money and time. So it's really important that we, when you're doing a process change, you understand how people accept process change and how you change people. Ironically, as an IT discipline, we are delivering things that change people's lives daily. But actually, we're probably one of the worst group of people when it comes to wanting to change ourselves. So we need to bear that in mind. A gentleman called Kolb came up with something called the learning styles graph. Now, what this basically shows is that when somebody learns something for the first time, they need concrete experience. They need to be led. They need to have the process provided for them. They don't know whether it's right or it's wrong. They just do what they're told. So an example I give you here is like when, certainly 25 years ago, when I was taught to drive, we had to hold the steering wheel with our hands at 10 to 2, which we all did diligently until we passed our test and got very comfortable, and then we'd do differently. And if you were my elder daughter today, you'd do it with one finger on the bottom of the steering wheel. Nothing I would recommend. But fundamentally, when we started, we had this, you did as you were told. Once you've started doing something for a while, you start to reflect on it, you start to observe what you're doing, you start to try and understand what is your part in this process, where do I fit? And once you start to understand that, you actually start thinking and abstracting out from the process, thinking, does this really work? Should we do this differently? And then ultimately, you get to a position of active experimentation where you start changing things unwittingly without realising it, because you realise that what you're doing isn't working. This is kind of where process becomes second nature, and you're able to evaluate whether the process is right or wrong. Now, an example I'll give you here was I've implemented a test management process in the past with a test management plan, and I was visited by a guy on a project that was 15 man days long, and he'd spent 10 man days trying to create an 80-page document for test management, and he didn't understand why that was a problem. So 15 days is the total cost of the project, and he spent 10 days writing an 80-day test plan for it. So again, you know, he was still up at the concrete experience level. He hadn't made his way around the cycle. Once he understood that, we started to get some working going. So people are really important, because as human beings, we learn process initially verbatim. We do as we're told. We have to learn it thoroughly before we can be agile with that. So experts have shown that it takes somewhere between 18 months and 2 years before you actually get the process fully embedded in an organisation and working properly. That's not saying you don't see benefits before then, but that's kind of the culmination of all the changes and benefits you've put in. But you have to remember that no matter how adaptable people are to change, there's always going to be cultural issues. And as I said, as IT people, we're not the best people to be changing. So here's an example here of a model, Kubler-Ross grease cycle in the Gartner hype cycle, with help from Dorothy Graham, who allowed me to use this picture, which shows that when we first get change, everybody gets very excited. You're suddenly recognised, you're important, you know, it's somebody thinking about you as a person, so some change happening to you. Then when you get to the top of the hype curve at the very left-hand side, you start to realise, actually, I've got to do something now. So you're starting to do this for real and starting to realise, my God, I've got work here, I've physically got to change. And as you go into this actual use period, there's an element of disillusionment. Oh, why am I doing this? I don't understand this properly, please. And the key here is that that as an implementer of a process change, you understand when that disillusionment curve has hit, and you do something to change that. So you work with individuals, you motivate, you drive, so that actually you bring some practical benefit ultimately from everybody being quite comfortable with the process. Now, the danger is that, as I see very often, is that people believe that process improvement is about just dropping a process on somebody's head and moving and walking away. So effectively, we get to the actual use stage, and people will, the projects will be disbanded, and disillusionment happens, and the process dies effectively because nobody's there to make sure it recovers. So it's very, very important that we remember that even once you finish the work and you're rolling it out, there's a need to keep a constant eye on what's going on around you. So to make good change work, agility is key. You can't just enforce the change if nobody understands it. So you need to be able to work with people to make sure that they're totally bought in. So that's kind of the background to all I'm going to say today. But to finish, a couple of conclusions here from there. The key points you take away from this is the first thing we need to remember is to measure where we are before we start. Do not leap into process change without at least first understanding where you are, so you can measure the improvement you've made and show the benefit in the work you've done. The next stage is decide where you want to go. What is it you want? Do you want a real Ferrari or do you want a Lada-based Ferrari process? Whatever's right for you, and horses for courses here, but you need to know that target that you're going towards. And most importantly, communicate at all times. Never, never disappear into a cocoon. Always find a way to communicate. I saw a change once being done within a major bank where actually about 6 weeks before the change was implemented, posters started appearing around the organisation asking questions that nobody quite understood. Got everybody's interest, and slowly as they got nearer to the date, the posters got more lucid on what it is that they were actually implementing. And people just knew, it was understood. It was a game. People watched and learned. So there are different ways of communicating, but you need to communicate at all times. But remember that it's people that make all this work. So if you ignore the people, you're bound to fail. So finally, just a quote I found recently from a guy called Fujio Chow, who used to be, or probably still is, I don't know, the president of Toyota Motor Corporation. He said, we get brilliant results from average people managing brilliant processes, while our competitors get average or worse results from brilliant people managing broken processes. So brilliant processes is the key. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I've got to say today. Are there any questions?
We have a few here, Jeff. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation today. We have one from Michael, and Michael Stahl. How was the potential benefit assessed in the financial benefits slide?
A very interesting question. Thank you, Michael. It's almost a presentation on its own to show you how that was drawn together. But it was about gathering data that existed within the organisation on defects, on the cost of testing, on the root cause of the defects that were going through the process, and managing all those together. There's an element of the defect detection percentages coming in there. So a reasonably complex spreadsheet that takes all of that data and merges it together. Unfortunately, it's not something I can include today. But yeah, so generally we looked at defects, cost of testing, root cause of analysis, all those kind of things. So quite a detailed analysis. And we worked with the organisation, so they totally bought into the method, so they were happy with the result.
Okay. I hope that answers that question.
Hopefully it does.
We have another question from Kenneth McCanna. Under prioritise and plan financial benefit, how do you estimate benefit to give a numeric value that is believable to customer?
Much the same question, I think, as Michael's there. In that it's about working with the customer so they understand where you're getting your data from. An example I'll give you here is my first ever process improvement project. I was actually responsible. I was a permanent employee of a company, and a consultancy came to me and told me that they could save the company £1 million. My first question was then, how are you going to do that? Now, they could not provide me with anything, and they would not show me how they actually got to that number. Now, the principal approach we take with the table you saw, that being the net result of our calculations, is that we open the spreadsheet up to the individual organisation and show them the data we're collecting. So we talk to them very closely. So they're bought in from day one. It's not just, here's your numbers, like it or lump it. It's an iterative and collaborative process. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay. I'm just waiting for a few more questions to come in. I think Thomas Klein has one. As an experienced tester, I am searching for an approach to get started with the hand-on for process analysis, assessments, and finally improvements. What would you suggest I could do in a kind of self-study way?
That's interesting. My preference, as I made very clear, I guess, in my presentation, was the TMMI model and the TAMAL, their assessment approach model that sits behind that. I think is probably the most open and uncommercial, if that's the right word, model out there today. So I would recommend you went to the website www.tmmifoundation.org and have a look at that, have a look at the model descriptions within there, have a look at the assessment approach details within there. Ask questions. The foundation has a sort of ask info situation, so you can ask questions. There's also a whole load of FAQs on there as well that you might find useful. That would be my view. There are a list of books, those methods that I put up on the slide. Steps, a book. Critical Test Process by Rex Black, that's a book. You could always buy those. They're very individual. They're based on an individual and personal view of test process, so may not be absolutely perfect for anybody, but will give people a view. That would be my initial tip. The other thing is to look around for training courses. Experimenters themselves do sort of TMI overview training courses, so show people how you go about doing assessments and everything. So you can always look at companies like ours. There's another company called Improve. Nothing to do with the method that we use for managing our improvement projects, but a company called Improve in Holland. There's another company you can go to where they do training courses that can help you if you're not based in the UK. Hopefully that gives you some start.
Okay, Jeff. And we have another question from Chris Newman. At a greenfield site, is it best to go for big impact process improvements or take baby step improvements?
Interesting question. Depends what you define by greenfield site. If you mean a greenfield project or a brand new company, they could be quite different, I guess. A greenfield project, probably, my experience of large greenfield projects is they do good process, and that tends to be big bang. So the process, the project is set up, and the processes are set up at the same time. So there's a very clear vision at the very start of the controls and the methods that will be used. So I've seen that work. I've also seen where people start with some of the process, just get the initial stages out of the way and then develop the process as they go. So it's a depends question, I think. The standard tester answer is it depends on the organisation and the people within it. But to be honest, the most success I've seen is when the organisation has at least at a high level defined its total picture of process, including testing, before it starts. So that would be big bang.
We have a question from Ian Howells. Clients are always looking for the return on investment to be as soon as possible. On average, when would you expect a return on investment to be realised in a process improvement? Less than 6 months, less than 12 months, or beyond?
I'm glad you've given me a choice. Thank you, Ian. To be honest, the answer to this again is it depends. Most process improvement projects, if you haven't been seen to provide any kind of benefit within 6 months, then the project may very well stop there. So I would say that you would be looking to try and make a benefit within the first 6 months of releasing the change. Now what's interesting is that there's a little bit of psychology that goes with a process change and the measurement that comes with it. So it would mean almost immediately if somebody's being measured whilst doing their process change, they're likely to be better at what they do even without you trying to make them better, because you're watching them. So there's an element of, I'm being watched now, I will be more efficient in what I do. So very quickly you can often find very quick benefits. Sometimes it's harder actually to show benefits over a longer period of time, but the experience has shown that if it's implemented properly and the communication's right, you can see some benefits relatively quickly within an organisation, because people just naturally do things better when they're being watched, and you're watching them while you're implementing. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, and we've just time for one last question, Jeff, from Abdul. When an organisation follows a lean development model like Agile, it is tough to justify a process-heavy approach like TQM, CCM, etc. to testing and quality. Have you faced any issues in this regard?
The issues we faced, I think, is that people don't believe using the approach we've done, I've presented here, works with Agile. And I think Agile, you're right, Agile tends to be a process-light approach. And in that instance, it's usually important that you're not seen to load companies up with process. So, yeah, I would say we use this ourselves for an agile company. It was a betting finance company, and what that enabled them to do is to identify the components of testing that they really needed to include to ensure the process was smooth. And the reason we did that was that particular client was already in a situation where they had some what I would call structured testers who refused to drop process. So by using the model and taking into account the principles of agile, it was easy to show, or this approach, right? It was easy to show where lean process could be put and the bits of the process that are no longer necessary. So, but it depends on the individuals. I'm sorry I keep saying depends, but this is all about people. Really, the process itself is very clear. It's all about how people choose to change. So, in a lean organisation, people who want to do heavy process will try and drive heavy process into a lean organisation. So it's how you manage that and how you show them the benefits of not doing that heavy process dependency. So hopefully that answers the question. They're rather quick, but hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, Jeff, thanks very much for that, for taking the time to answer the questions and for the interesting webinar this morning. I just want to remind everybody that a full recorded version of today's webinar will be available upon the EuroSTAR webinar archive, and also you'll be able to engage there with Jeff in our community forum section on the EuroSTAR website. If you have any more questions that need to be answered, Jeff will be able to help there with any more questions you have regarding this webinar this morning. So thank you all for attending this morning's webinar. Can you now all ensure to log out, as the webinar is now over and finished. Thank you very much.